Everybody. My name is Eric Hines. I'm curator of Film at Museum of the Moving Image, and you have found us at the Reverse Shot Happy Hour for Wednesday, October 7th. If you're here live, thanks for tuning in. If you're finding us on YouTube, thanks for finding us there. Just want to welcome you to this week's Happy Hour. We are solidly into fall, and in October, we are beginning the celebrations for Halloween this week at the Reverse Shot Happy Hour. If you've been paying attention to Reverse Shot over the years, you know that Halloween is a significant holiday for us as a publication. This is the first time we've ever had a chance to see what the happy hour might be like in terms of that interest, or should I say obsession, on behalf of two of our hosts this week, the editors and founders of Reverse Shot, Jeff Reichert and Michael Koresky. Let's see them now.
Hello. Hey, Eric.
Buddy.
Thanks for that great intro.
You're welcome.
Michael, you're looking excellent.
Yeah, you would think so. And why don't you tell them why?
So what Michael has on his face right now is a mask that I made at his house one evening 4 or 5 years ago.
I've had it for a long time. Yes.
That he somehow has held on to. I'm not really good at crafts in any way, shape, or form, but I made that mask, and it's kind of
What are you talking about? You're perfectly good at crafts, as you can tell.
It fits his face perfectly. It's well proportioned.
It's stuck with us through the years.
Have a good time. See you guys later.
Thank you. Hey, Jeff.
Hello, Michael. How are you?
I'm fine, though we are upset that Farihah Zaman, our co-host, cannot join us today.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think she'd love to be here, but we are going to be talking about scary movies, and I think we're going to be talking about scary movies a lot this month, and not just because the world is an absolute horror show, but because Halloween is coming up.
Yeah, we have this. We can talk more about this today, later, whenever. But Reverse Shots had this ongoing feature every October in the week up to Halloween. So we haven't started it yet. We call it A Few Great Pumpkins. And so we have 7 days of Halloween programming or recommendations for films that some of them are really iconic films, some of them are maybe less known horror movies, or just movies that generally have scared us or our contributors. And, this year will be no exception. So I'm always excited to see what our writers come up with. And it seems like we're running out, but I know there is no way to run out of great horror movies. We've been doing it this is gonna be 15 years, I believe.
15 years, so that's 8 movies a year, so that's 120 recommendations. Or we do 7?
Yeah, it's a week, it's 7.
With 7, yeah, that's a lot of horror films.
It's a lot of horror films, yeah. I think that Eric's right, it is a little bit of an obsession. And I don't know why we stick to this schedule. Like, we can watch horror movies all year long, but everything always feels like it should be done in October. And I'm very excited about our guest today to talk about this.
I mean, and it's an interesting, the Great Pumpkins thing has always been interesting for me specifically because I didn't, Michael grew up watching horror movies. And by the time with his mother. And by the time we'd established Reverse Shot, he was kind of well-versed in the canon. But when I was growing up, I didn't watch any of that stuff because I was a wimp. I really could not handle it. I remember being dragged by some friends to go see The Fly 2, which I don't even think is particularly scary. Like, I don't think I would look back on that and find it particularly scary, but I didn't have the stomach for it. And so it wasn't until we started working together, Michael was like, well, you should see Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You should see Halloween, that I started kind of getting into this. And now I'm pretty on board, even though I feel like I have a lot to catch up on.
I think that there's still a lot for you to discover, Jeff. And I know that I'm going to keep on forcing you to watch horror movies forever and forcing you to make Halloween masks, I have to say as well. I also wanted to say that the opening, the overture, this connection only just hit. Maybe you'll know what I'm about to say, Jeff. But the opening song, which was of course Ministry, has a connection to this week's framed film comment cover. Do you remember what the connection is, Jeff? If anyone can see behind my prized wax skull that I have lit. AI artificial intelligence with Jude Law's beautiful robot face as the cover. Do you remember that Ministry has a cameo in AI?
Wait.
At the Flesh Fair.
Oh my God, you're right. God, it's been a few years since I've seen it. That's amazing.
Hadn't even thought of that, but one of our guests actually chose today's selected song, so that's just a perfect confluence of events. I'm very excited to talk about them. And do you think we should bring them on?
Yeah, I don't think we should wait. We're bringing on two New York film folks who are big into the world of horror genre films. I think our theme, we were sort of thinking about, at least for this week, what we're calling disreputable horror, and we can talk about what we mean by disreputable versus reputable in a genre that has generally always been considered disreputable to a certain extent. But today we're going to be talking with Caroline Golum, who's a filmmaker and critic, and has been has frequented, or I guess I should say haunted, the Reverse Shot Happy Hour before. And then a dear old friend, Cristina Cacioppo, a programmer here in New York, formerly at the Alamo Draft House, both of them coming in from Brooklyn.
Come on in.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Unmute yourself, Gollum.
Boo.
You both look great. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So yeah, I think before we dive in, or as we dive in, Jeff sort of got at this idea of disreputable versus reputable. And when we started talking about this, what are some of your more disreputable horror picks? It started to strike us that there's a lot more disreputable than reputable when it comes to horror, because even the movies that we might think of now as the hallowed classics, like the classy horror films, like even Kubrick's The Shining, Hitchcock's Psycho, the ones that are held up as the arbiters of the genre, when they came out, they were considered kind of like their directors descending into scuzzball aesthetics, and they weren't well liked. It takes a long time for these opinions to even come around. So in a sense, this is sort of easy, because everything is disreputable when it comes to horror.
It's true.
We'd love to hear if when we first posed this idea to you, what came to mind immediately?
Well, I was thinking about video nasties, which is what, the British kind of dubbed, once home video was happening, they classified all these movies, including Texas Chainsaw and even Night of the Living Dead, as video nasties, and some were banned from being on home video. And yeah, I was thinking about it because I wondered if it was sort of redundant in a way, because to some folks, probably all forms of horror are disreputable. And then, when I was thinking about it, I liked thinking about the angle that from a horror fan's point of view would end up being disreputable to them because they didn't like it. So I was thinking about franchises and movies within franchises that disrupted the franchise and pissed off the fans of those movies. So, but then eventually, it seems like everything eventually gets revisited and finds its audience. So Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is a good example, because that movie came out, and at the time it was just like, where are you taking this? And now people love it. It's such a good time. And Halloween 3, which, completely did away with Michael Myers he's not in the movie at all, and people hated it, and now people kind of love it because it's its own sort of apocalyptic, crazy nightmare. So that's where my head went.
I'd actually, before we get too deep into it, I'd love to hear a little bit more about Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, because for those who haven't seen it, this actually is considered by many queer film scholars to be probably the queerest horror movie ever made, at least the queerest 80s movie, though Hellraiser gives it a run for its money. We'll definitely talk about Hellraiser. But Freddy's Revenge is, can you give us a slight description of that movie? Because it's pretty...
Sure. I mean, it's funny because it's not even subtext. When you watch it, if you you kind of hear about it, and it's oh, it must have this sort of underlying thing. And it's you watch it and it's no, it's all right in front of your face. It involves this new kid who moves to town, and then he moves into the house on Elm Street. And, basically he's flirting with this girl, but he has this friend, this hot dude friend that there's always this sort of weird tension with. And it's like anytime he seems to get horny, Freddie like comes into his body. And there's a scene with his gym teacher that's like very S&M. What am I missing? Like, and also the very iconic, like unpacking his room, like dancing to the song "Hold Me All Night Long," and he like shoots this little ball out of this like weird toy.
It's like a very on the surface queer text, right?
Yes, it's all there. And apparently, like what I've heard is that the writer was sort of trying to have a laugh in a way and like being a dick about it. And, you know, the actor Mark Patton, who's in it, I think at the time said it ruined his career, but now he's sort of made a career out of just sort of making appearances and talking about it. And there's even a documentary that sort of like looks into that movie specifically. Scream Queen, I think it's called. Are you guys familiar with it? Yeah, it's wild. And it's really good. It's a really fun horror movie, and it's got some scary, you know, Freddy stuff is always pretty fun to me. Like I kind of love that whole franchise, you know, almost all of it.
Well, the wisecracking horror villain is a fascinating character because he's always the most likable. He's always the most seductive of all the characters. Like the really dull teenagers, you're fine with them being picked off one by one because they have no personalities, but you have this really engaging, fun villain. And that goes to the heart of the queerness of horror films, I think. Caroline, we don't want you to feel dejected in your room of purple.
It's so amazing.
I never feel dejected in my room of purple, but thank you.
How have you done that? Like, what is the setup?
I have like a clamp light that I got at a hardware store, and I have a red light bulb.
Awesome.
It works.
Old New Orleans, right?
So tell us, what's the first thing that came to your mind when we asked you to come on?
Obviously, I thought about, just like you said, horror is like a disreputable genre, and specifically the way that people talk about elevated horror or elevated genre, which I think is so condescending and so patronizing. I fucking hate that. And I don't mean to denigrate anybody who uses that as an appropriate term, but like all genre is elevated to me, and all horror is elevated to me because it deals with a lot of psychology. I mean, our baser instincts are the foundation of these movies anyway. But my mind immediately went to less so the supernatural, more like early, what they would call thrillers or like suspense movies, you know, from before World War II, because that's where my mind always is. So I was thinking about like Old Dark House, speaking of canonically queer horror titles.
Exactly.
The movie is as queer as the Queen's Hat Box. And then also Mad Love with Peter Lorre, who is not gay in that movie, but I think of him as like a counterpart to the character in M, like somebody who's sexually arrested, which gets lumped in with queerness around that time. And then also, you know, like Night at the Wax Museum, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, like movies that are not about ghosts so much as they are about parapsychology or abnormal psychology, and how they come from this place where like psychoanalysis and psychology was like an emerging field after World War I, right? Everybody got the Freud bug. So we're looking at all these horrible things that people do and trying to attach some sort of reason for it, which is why the last 10 minutes of that movie, I think Psycho does this really well too, is like some authoritative white guy coming in and saying, well, here's the problem. It's his mom's fault, or, you know, whatever. So, you know, that's my preference for horror movies. But I like a good old fashioned slasher. I like watching hot teens get picked off one by one, you know? And then also Cristina and I were talking before this about giallos too, movies that are like real schlocky, like very clearly, you know, close up of somebody's boobs while they're getting stabbed. We talked earlier about the black gloved hand, like that S&M imagery. But those movies are also some of the most technically beautiful films ever made too. So when we say disreputable, like, are we talking about the subject matter, which is actually really frightening and cool? Because we're not talking about the filmmaking technique. I think Mario Bava is like, you know, and Dario Argento too, some of the most accomplished filmmakers that the medium has ever seen, you know. So yeah, not to cop out, but like no horror is disreputable. I think
that's the point that we all wanted to get to, and you got there nice and early. Lucio Fulci, even, right? The dregs in a way. That's beautiful filmmaking a lot of the time, and that's actually a film that my friend during college sat on top of me and pried my eyes open to make me watch, because I had heard about the infamous Zombie. I'm talking about Fulci's Zombie. I had heard about the infamous eyeball slicing, and I refused to watch it. And she made sure that I watched it. She held me down, clamped my eyes open.
When Buñuel does it, it's art, right? But when Fulci does it, everybody raises the hue and cry.
I'd like to go back to the old dark house. Sorry, Jeff, were you going to say something?
No, I was just agreeing with Caroline about.
I wanted to go back to the old dark house. And I promise that I don't only want to dive into overtly or even subtextually queer horror movies, even though maybe I will. The old dark house is James Whale, who of course, many people know now, was an out filmmaker in the 30s. And he directed Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein being sort of considered a camp classic now. But The Old Dark House gives even that a run for its money in terms of camp, and in terms of just like one character after another having some sort of queered aspect to it, right? And it's an incredible, I mean, Charles Laughton is in it, and oh my God, Melvin Douglas, Gloria Stewart. And it's kind of the quintessential boring heteros show up at this house because of a lightning storm, and then they get sucked into this world of degradation and perversity.
And that influences in so many other movies. I mean, you basically described the plot of Rocky Horror, which we should also talk about at some point, not to like make this the gayest happy hour ever, but like Rocky Horror. So good. Or The Innocents, or not The Innocents, The Haunting, right? Another classic example of like sexually repressed people. I mean, I think of Old Dark House too as like the proto Clue. You know, they took the like classic Victorian drawing room jewel thief mystery and just they took it to like a whole other extreme level that, you know, we think of it as camp, and also like Bride of Frankenstein is a camp movie too. And camp is also like a really important part of horror, as we can all agree. But those movies I think were made by people who were very self-aware. I mean, James Whale, like you said, was out. Like, you watch Bride of Frankenstein, some of that framing, girl knew what she was doing. You know what I mean? Like, that movie is deliberately queer. I think Old Dark House is like as deliberately queer as it can be for the era, because they were having fun. I mean, I think a lot of these movies were just made by like, not to paint a kind of broad brush on it, but like they were made by kind of low class people, like, you know, glove merchants who became movie theater operators, or like third-rate vaudevillians who landed in LA, you know, like okay British actors who became really famous in the United States. So they're not coming from like a super highbrow place with these movies. It's not like they're all like versed in Moliere, or maybe they were, I don't know. But they went into it being like, let's do something like a little fun. Let's scare the shit out of these people. Like, they want their nickel's worth, and they're going to get it.
I was curious, Cristina, as someone who has been known in New York for a long time as a great programmer, and someone who's really brought people together, and someone who's had a real distinct personality in her programming. I'm wondering, especially because we're not able to gather in theaters right now and watch horror movies, which is one of the delights of watching horror movies, and I think it's worth acknowledging that loss. But I wonder, when you programmed horror movies, which was often, as far as I recall, at Alamo and even before that, what were you looking for in an experience as a programmer of horror films? What do you want that experience to be like? What kind of audience response and community?
Yeah, I mean, I think a good thing to kind of talk about, because every year we would do a horror marathon, you know, towards the end of October, and that's what I'm really going to miss this year. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea for that is that we wouldn't announce what movies we were going to show. So it would be a surprise. And so for something like that, you know, like I always wanted to have a mix, like, you know, you don't want to have like the super obvious stuff, but you want people to be happy. You don't want them to be disappointed. And luckily for the most part, like in New York, you know, you have a pretty adventurous audience. So, you know, I really tried to have a good balance of things that might seem familiar, but people haven't watched in a while, or that people just had no idea what it was, but I knew it was going to blow their mind. So like last year, you know, and I do spend a lot of time throughout the year, like watching things, even things that are new to me, to start thinking about what I want to do. So last year I showed Bones, which is like the 2001 Ernest Dickerson movie with Snoop Dogg. And I loved it. And I, you know, like I was just like, okay, this is one of those things that I know might be a little bit divisive, but but I also could kind of guess that maybe it hasn't shown in New York, like, so, and I did like to kind of like once in a while pull out those movies, like the movies that maybe hadn't yet been revisited, or, re-experienced. And the other one that I did last year was Slumber Party Massacre 2, which is a great time. And, if you want to talk about disreputable, like the Slumber Party movies, like hopefully people know, like those movies are directed by women. And like the sort of main thing is sort of taking this idea of this sort of like, like slasher movie that has a lot of tits and just sort of like owning the look of it. And when we watch these movies, like they're a lot of fun, and the women are, sort of like empowered in a certain way, even though it has, they're all like very, very 80s. Like in Slumber Party Massacre 2, there's like, they have like a girl band, and it's super cheesy, but it's also really fun because you have this character that is like this, he has a guitar with a drill on it, and he's basically just sort of like, it's another thing of like the fear of losing virginity and all of that. So, and horror movies really are kind of the most fun to watch with an audience. So like, it's really exciting to sort of see how people react, in that setting. So, I've tried so many different kinds of movies, and, like, it's interesting to see how things land. Sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do. Like, there's so many different kinds of tastes out there. So like, you kind of never know, like, even if it's sort of like a majority audience, like won't be into it, like there'll be like this like very passionate group that will be super into it. So that kind of makes it worthwhile.
And it's one of those genres that as I've started watching more horror films, you start to realize that there's like somebody will find their lane as far as horror, and they will just like take it all the way. And it's like finding anything they can get their hands on that kind of fits that mold, from whatever country, from whatever period. But like, I feel like there's something about this specifically that encourages people to just kind of like go nuts and go really deep with it.
Yeah, definitely.
What's an example of a movie that didn't land the horror movie marathon? I'm very curious, and why you think that was.
Well, for one thing, this was when, this was in Yonkers, so that could be one factor. When I was working for the Alamo there and doing the horror marathon. And there was this movie that I loved as a kid called Lady in White.
Oh my God.
Okay.
Loved as a kid, but yes,
yeah.
Same.
And I knew that it was sort of an off choice because like it kind of is a kid's movie, but it was something that was really creepy to me. Like the little girl, like the ghost girl singing that song, like something stayed with me. And I actually thought that it aged pretty well, like save for some weird sort of like, race stuff that wasn't racist, but was like weirdly just like off at the time. And I think the Yonkers audience definitely wanted their sort of like titty slashers, so like not getting that in this movie that was like very chaste, but like still spooky, I think like pissed some people off. But it was one where there were some people that either had seen it as a kid or, that were like very excited about it.
So that was a movie that I adored as a child, and when I watched it again not that long ago, I was super excited to see it again, and I realized why I liked it as a child. Like you say, it's kind of a kid's movie, but even on that level, it wasn't working at all this time. It was really borrowing it borrowed really heavily from The Uninvited, which is a great film, one of my favorites that I've grown to appreciate in recent years. And so it felt like this weird pale imitation done in more of a cheesy, like pseudo Spielbergian style.
Yeah, I feel that for sure, but sometimes I fall for that. So yeah.
Well, so speaking of horror movies in childhood, Caroline, how long have you been into horror movies? Oh, you're muted. How did that happen?
There was somebody idling at a light outside my window, honking and playing music, so I muted myself. I'll tell you, because I mentioned when we were emailing about this, my like youthful fixation on Tim Burton movies, which I think is a very common youthful fixation because he's kind of a perpetual angsty teen. And so when one is an angsty teen, there's always some Tim Burton movie that you can glom onto. Not a fan of his of his later output, but the early stuff is like pretty good. So we had Beetlejuice on tape, and I have a very vivid memory of being around, I don't know, 4 years old, like a 4th of July barbecue at my parents' suburban ranch house in the San Fernando Valley. And while the adults were outside grilling and chilling, I thought, I'm bored, I'm gonna put on a movie. And I said, can I put on Beetlejuice? And my, distant parents were like, yeah, well, do you know how to use the tape player? Okay, fine. So I put it on. And in the middle of the day, I was like completely scared shitless. The scene where Gina Davis like rips her face off in the clock. I mean, right? I would say it's also getting back to the Tim Burton thing, like on par with the Large March scene in Pee-wee's Big Adventure too. That sudden,
Seminal.
The scariest.
Yeah, like raise your hand in the Zoom if that movie completely fucked you up. Specifically, Large Marge, right? Like, come on, come among us. So I loved that movie. As a kid, my mom would read like Edgar Allan Poe to me a lot, like The Raven, things like that. So there was always like a macabre stuff in the house. I watched a lot of early cartoons with like dancing skeletons for some reason, like a xylophone ribcage kind of deal. And so it's always been like a part of my media diet from a youthful age. I'm not a horror obsessive to the degree that other people are. I'm not a completist with certain filmographies. I don't just watch any movie because there's blood in it. I prefer things that are, like I said, more psychological than supernatural, but I've been watching them forever. And so that the feeling of being terrified is something that I absolutely adore. And I would say that the reason why I don't watch a lot of horror movies, or why I'm not a big fan of so many of the ones that I've seen, is that they're not scary enough. Like I'm trying to get back to that early place, again with the Freud, that early place of like being terrified at 4th of July, and just a lot of them just don't cut the mustard. Like, especially any movie that's like a slasher or violent, like, real life is as scary as that. Show me something that's like, weird that I can't get anywhere else. I can watch people get fucked up on the news every night. I would rather see a bunch of people going slowly mad, or a movie that has a little bit more camp value, like Spider Baby, for instance, or Bucket of Blood. That kind of the real weird stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder what I'm looking for. I was going to say a similar thing. Like, I wonder what I'm looking for as I age and I continue to watch horror movies. I don't feel like I actually get scared very much anymore. And I think part of that is just resistance to certain things and tropes as I get older and I actually feel more mortal. I didn't, when I would watch a slasher film in my early 20s, I never ever actually thought about the knife penetrating the body for real and that it signified some kind of actual death. These didn't feel like real characters. This didn't feel like real things. I do find myself to be less seduced by those kinds of films as I get older. And I don't know if that's partly just a matter of aging, it's just part of the process, or if these movies just aren't well done anymore. I can feel suspense. I can feel a relative engagement with some of these latter day horror films, particularly slashers, but it's been a long time since I've felt the same excitement and fear that I had when I was young. So yes, it's this continued effort to regain that childhood feeling.
Yeah, when was the last time you all were really, really scared by a movie in the theater?
Not shocked, but like scared.
Like scared, really, really scared.
Because there's a jump scare. But sorry.
Yeah, and I think you get more disgusted now. Like things are more sort of just like really
gross,
disgusting. And that's not the same feeling as watching something that is just sort of like just like somebody being ripped apart or whatever. Yeah, I mean, I think about this a lot because I don't think that there are a lot of like genuinely scary movies. Like the only movie that I think is like actually genuinely terrifying is The Entity.
Oh.
And it's for a lot of reasons, like, because it's like about a single mother being raped by an invisible presence, like and nobody believes her. So like that movie's like kind of the only movie that I find like actually terrifying. New movies, I don't really know.
I mean, I actually was pretty scared by the Babadook, which has become this kind of like ridiculous internet meme at this point.
Yeah.
When I first saw it, I was genuinely scared by it. And, that's rare. I mean, there are a lot of great, fully entertaining, recent horror movies. I mean, I really like Hereditary and Midsommar. I really like Get Out. I mean, these are terrific movies in terms of just like pit of your stomach fear. The Babadook, and actually, this is sort of funny and maybe too much to admit, but I thought Insidious was just absolutely terrifying. Like the first Insidious, and Jeff knows that this is, I'm not making this up, and I think you felt the same way. Like I was like, I nearly peed my pants. I was so fucking scared by that movie.
Yeah, I was actually going to say Insidious was the last time I remember being kind of like sitting in a seat in a movie theater with my hands looking at the screen with my hands over my eyes, because I was just, it's like, and I think that's one of the things I've come to appreciate about horror movies, and the horror movies I look back on is I love that sense of, I love when it feels like the filmmaker is just going to like do things to me and I'm not going to know where it's coming from or what it's going to be. And I mean, everything in Insidious, if you break it down into its parts, you've seen it in other movies before.
Oh, yeah.
People standing in corners and crawling up at walls, moving strangely, all that kind of stuff. But it's so maximal in a way that it totally shook me and it totally unsettled me.
Expertly placed faces in the corners of frames will just always do it to me. And that movie was just one after another, to the extent that like I just didn't even want to look at the screen after a while because something was going to come out of somewhere. And they're such cheap scares, but they were so well done in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And The Wailing, actually, the Korean film recently, just really got under my skin. Really uncomfortable.
Don't negate the power though of the cheap scare. I mean, I know that I was just lamenting the use of jump scares in a movie, but if they're deployed consistently and artfully, not like one big jump scare, but like an aggregate series of discomforts, I think that's really impactful. And suspense too. I mean, you know, as we all have gotten older, that seems to be a through line here, like straightforward gore is kind of, it's gross because we're all keenly aware of our bodies and our immortality and the ways in which they're slowly breaking down, obviously. But I think that like a long undercurrent, like this low vibrating hum of suspense, that's really, really unsettling, right? Like, I'm trying to think of a recent example. I think the most recent horror movie that I saw, like new release horror movie, I watched Spree last night, which is a horror movie and it's a slasher and it's very good, but it's not about suspense so much as like, you know what's going to happen and so you dread it. Like Hitchcock's apocryphal thing about showing the bomb under the bench first. Oh, my CSA is here. Great. But the
Terrifying.
Yeah, I know. Let's scare Jessica to death. Oh, I Spit on Your Grave, which Cristina and I watched a couple years ago. That movie is like similar to the film that I watched last night. Like, you know, really bad stuff is going to keep happening to this woman. And then the question becomes, how bad will it get? Like, how gross will it be? Is she ever going to shake this? And I think that movie and The Entity have a lot in common. A lot of female-driven horror movies have that in common. The idea of like, this bad thing is happening to you, no one believes you. I think a lot of women are very terrified by that prospect because they've lived it to some degree or another, minimally or in a very extreme and traumatic way. Like forever, women have been told that, you know, oh, you're making it up, or it's your period, or your uterus is free floating throughout your body and that's why you're upset, you know. But to be in a film like The Entity or like The Sentinel, I mean, Rosemary's Baby is another great example of like, why doesn't anybody believe that this is happening? Like, we know it's really happening, but it's not. I love those films for that because it puts everybody in the audience, regardless of where they fall on the gender spectrum, in the place of this vulnerable woman who's just like, oh, we all agree with you, but like we're watching the people around you behave, you know, really kind of thickly and being ignorant of your pain and your fear.
And shout out to Rosemary's Baby as maybe the greatest horror movie of all time. I'm just going to say it here. I'm just going to say that and put it out there. And then we can move on. And I think it's considered reputable because it, you know, Ruth Gordon won an Oscar for it and all that. But I mean, when it comes down to it, like, why is that reputable?
I mean, it was based on an Ira Levin book, and as far as I'm concerned, he was kind of like a raised lettering, like grocery store novelist. I wasn't alive back then, but I seem to recall he's not considered like canonical American literature like John Updike or whatever. He wrote kind of like genre stuff, like Stepford Wives, I think he wrote too.
Stepford Wives. And
yeah.
Sliver. He wrote Sliver.
Oh shit, okay. Yeah, so he's on that level, but like when you take something that's so well written and you adapt it for the screen like that. In the original novel too, Rosemary's supposed to be like a very kind of curvaceous, like overly feminine, really like sexual housewife and maternal presence, and in Rosemary's Baby, obviously, Mia Farrow, very different vibe, but it works because she's like a little fawn, right?
Speaking of adaptations, and I was reminded of this just because there's a lot of comments from viewers over here naming some of their favorites, and somebody mentioned David Raposo mentioned the recent Richard Stanley, Nicolas Cage, Color Out of Space movie, which I did see, and this is based on an H.P. Lovecraft short story that's absolutely one of my favorite stories. And I was actually, I was disappointed by the film just because it leaned so much into the Nicolas Cage camp thing. But there were moments of it that were quite unnerving. But it made me think about adaptations of great horror stories and how it's very, very rare that you can translate that brand of fear, that kind of effectiveness that works on the page to the screen. And I was actually, if anyone could think of good examples of something that actually worked. And sometimes it's adapted just enough, like the Daphne du Maurier, The Birds short story is so terrifying. It's such an incredibly terrifying story, but it has nothing to do with Hitchcock's movie. It's completely different. So I'm trying to think of something that actually...
I mean, any Stephen King adaptations like that maybe stand out? As scary, I don't... Yeah, I mean, The Shining is a good example.
Misery?
But so different also. Which one?
Misery.
Misery's so much fun.
It's super fun, but
yeah, not scary. Yeah,
I think it's scary. It puts James Caan in the role of the helpless woman. You get that gender flip.
That's true. That's true. But in so doing, it makes Kathy Bates into the most like hateful, disgusting female character.
Women can be hateful and disgusting too, Michael.
Can they? No, never. No, I do love Misery. And I was thinking of all of those. If we must talk about Stephen King, and because I read a lot of Stephen King as a kid, as I'm sure many people did, but there was that whole spate of auteur cinema, right, of the late 70s, early 80s that were Stephen King adaptations, and it's actually really like Cronenberg, De Palma, Kubrick, Romero. It's really interesting to think about how Once Upon a Time he was like prestige horror. I guess that happened again with It, but I really hated the recent It film.
Oh yeah.
What about Don't Look Back is a really good adaptation. Speaking of du Maurier, that I think.
Don't Look Now.
Or sorry, yeah, Don't Look Now. Don't Look Back is the Bob Dylan documentary. Sorry guys, I've been. I got in on the toast a little early. Yeah, Don't Look Now. That movie's scary as shit. And again, like we don't know if this stuff is really in these. I'm not going to spoil it with the reveal, which is very high camp. Very high camp, but another one of those psychological films that builds suspense where you're like, what's going on? Like, who are these people going mad? Is this stuff really happening? I believe it's set in Venice, which is the campiest, sexiest, and scariest location to set your film. Was it not Kindness of Strangers, Company of Strangers, the Paul Schrader picture with Christopher Walken, also set in Venice, horny, scary locale. Something about those canals really, really upsets people. That movie was very well done. And then also, which I mentioned by mistake earlier, theme of the evening, The Innocents, which I think is based on Turn of the Screw, right?
That's the perfect example. Yes, thank you.
And then there's that weird prequel with Marlon Brando and his bad Irish accent, which I can't remember the name of. I'm
really glad you brought up The Innocents. Even more than the Robert Wise adaptation of Haunting of Hill House, I think The Innocents is sort of like it's the perfect film version of a Victorian ghost story. I can't imagine anything better.
It's so good. Deborah Carr helped. She's very Victorian.
Are you all familiar with a film called Eye of the Devil by any chance?
It sounds... Was Sharon Tate in it?
It's. I was thinking about adaptations. I don't know the source material. It is based on a novel, but it is Sharon Tate's first movie, and it's one of those things that we taped off TCM just because we were taping an entire run of Halloween films last year, and my partner and I put it on. And it's a movie, and it's another one of these things that come to love about horror films, is that like within a certain kind of framework, you can kind of insert almost any scenario and keep me or certain viewers watching. The whole premise is that there is David Niven lives with his wife, Deborah Kerr, in London, and he gets a mysterious phone call and has to go back to the family home, which is a vineyard in France. And it turns out, this is revealed over the course of the film, that his family has owned this vineyard for years, and they have a pact with the folks who actually run the vineyard, the kind of like the French peasants, that if things go wrong, like if there's a drought or if the crop is bad a certain year, that the male head of the family has to kill himself essentially in the vineyard. And it just, it's so, obviously the whole thing is completely improbable. It makes no sense, but there's like, there's real skill in making it. It's clearly a filmmaker who was looking at what was happening in filmmaking at the time in 1968 and thinking, here are interesting things I could do with the camera. Here are interesting jump cuts I could introduce. It feels really fresh in a certain way that, like, Hammer films of the period don't have like a cinematic freshness in a certain way. And in fact, like their staleness is actually what makes them sort of awesome, I think. But that was one, speaking of adaptations, that just kind of, it snuck up on me.
And I love this it's internal logic that narrative seems to have, right? And that's one of the creepy things about probably some of the best horror movies, is they function on these their own strange, off-balance logic. And I was thinking more about the question of what has recently scared me. I guess Twin Peaks: The Return is probably the scariest recent movie
You did it.
That I've seen. Is everyone here done the whole experience? I think it's actually the movie. I keep doing
the movie. It's fine.
The 18-hour movie. The 18-hour movie that was on Showtime. It starts probably like straight out of the gate as horror, right? That first episode, I obviously goes in all sorts of other directions. But I would say episodes 1, 2, 8, and the end feel like genuine horror films.
Yeah, that finale was really like unsettling and like scary and sad.
Yeah,
I was very affected by it. Yeah.
Yeah. Has there been anything like that that's gotten under your skin? And if not, I have a question I'm going to ask instead.
I mean, there's nothing like Twin Peaks: The Return. It's insane. I mean, and it also touches at all these other points of like things that are supernatural, but also the inherent scariness and horror show that is American life, both in the past and in our present day. And the idea of feeling trapped or constrained in some way and unable to fix things. It's got that Greek tragedy element where you're trying to rectify something that is your destiny and you can't get away from it. Nuclear power is really fucking terrifying too. And small towns, things of that nature. I mean, the other realms that we don't have access to. I mean, you could make a very compelling case that like the Black Lodge and all these other spaces outside the real world of Twin Peaks are not real at all, but actually just parts of someone's deep psychology. Not to be like Tyler Durden about it, but I mean, that is like one read on the movie, but I mean, I can't think of anything that's fucked me up as much as Twin Peaks: The Return in the last 4 or 5 years. Although time is also blending together for me, so I have no idea when anything came out.
Something I watched recently, which actually like one thing I've been doing recently is watching some 2000s horror movies, because like a lot of times for me, like I don't pay attention to things like I feel like horror movies are like wine, like they have to be on the shelf for a little while before you should take them and like actually look at them. So I've been watching all these movies, and one that actually really unsettled me that actually doesn't have any supernatural stuff in it is Eden Lake with Michael Fassbender.
I saw that.
It's just, there's a lot of things, like you never really know what's going to happen next, and like all these like horrible things just keep happening, and you kind of wonder if the movie's going to go there or not. And it was really upsetting to me because like things happen and people get killed and things happen in a certain way, and the main characters make decisions that are really awful, and yeah, I found it really upsetting. Even just as a thing that could happen, because it's just basically about sort of like, teens, and I'm really afraid of teens. So, so that did it for me.
It does. That's true. It has there's a lot of those horror movies, right? There's
Menacing teens, yeah.
that French movie, Them, Eel, that's all about these menacing kids who show up at this couple's house late at night and just torture them all night, chase them around. That really got to me, actually. I just thought of something that I can't believe it took me this long to mention, because it was my introductory essay to last year's Pumpkins, which is the Unfriended Dark Web, which I love the Unfriended films. I think they're
they're great.
They're kind of like virtuosic, but the second one is really disturbing, and very, very much worth talking about in this format.
We saw that in the theater too.
Yeah, you're right. I'm glad you remembered this movie, because it is unsettling, and it is the kind of thing that you can imagine happening. Like, like it's not beyond the realm of possibility, even though it has these, because it's different than the first one. And I can't remember how much the supernatural plays a role in Dark Web.
The first one for sure.
Yeah, as much as the first one. But yeah, you're right. Like I definitely was unsettled. Caroline, I can't remember how you because had you seen the first one?
I'd never seen the first one, and I'd also never seen what I call a computer movie, which is a movie that's made to look like a computer.
Yeah.
And I was kind of resistant at first because I look at a computer all the time, and that fucking sucks. But I was really taken by this movie, and I think the supernatural component to it, even though it doesn't have like spooky ghosts, is the internet, right? The titular dark web. Like, this is a realm not unlike the realm of the supernatural, which I believe in personally, that we can't know everything about. That's
we can't see it.
We can't see it. It exists around us. It's parallel to our own lives. You can cross over into it and cross back. But the dark web is fucking scary. And it's also one of those things that exists in real life that's incredibly opaque and we don't know anything about, and really frightening. Like, I don't know what the dark web looks like. So the version of the dark web in that movie, I watched it, I'm like, wow, they really did their research. This must be what the dark web is like. But it is something that can happen to you in real life, like I've only seen a ghost once, so I don't count on like seeing a bunch of ghosts all the time and it being a part of my scary life. But like, the internet's right there in front of us. We're on it right now, so who's to say that there isn't some nefarious force working behind the scenes? Desktop cinema, Edo says in the chat. Thank you, not computer movie. That's the technical term. Who's to say that there isn't somebody like right now trying to, and what's scarier than having somebody like steal your fucking identity on the internet and like pretend to be you, or like buy a bunch of stuff with your credit card, or like, it's like, it's all possible. Not to scare everybody, but that could be happening right now. We wouldn't even know.
Well, this century began with one of the great, is it maybe the great internet ghost movie, which is Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Pulse.
Oh yeah.
Which I actually used to be kind of obsessed with, and I think it's become the butt of many jokes because it's the trappings of it are so dated now, right? Whenever a ghost is about to appear, you hear like the dial-up sound or something.
I love that.
It's actually absolutely terrifying, and what it does is it uses the idea of an internet ghost as a metaphor for loneliness, right? So people don't just they're not murdered by the ghosts as far as we can tell, but they disappear into their own loneliness. They kind of turn into smudges of ash on the wall. I just find I get chills when I think about it. It's so beautifully made, of course, because it's Kurosawa. But I think that, putting aside maybe the way some people denigrate it by talking about the dated trappings, it's certainly worth looking at as both a relic of the early aughts, but then also a film whose relevance continues.
Well, I mean, in that category, Michael, I know you and I both are huge fans, but Blair Witch is a relic of its era, but also I think holds up in every possible way, though of course of its moment.
That's an incredible movie, actually. If we could, another film that I wrote about in one of the previous Pumpkins, which meant that I had to go back and watch it again just to make sure I wasn't insane when I first saw it. It was an advanced screening they showed to NYU kids, and so it was like a few months early, and we all thought we were seeing some special thing. We didn't really know what it was, and so it was pre-hype. It was post-Sundance hype, but it was still pre-general hype, and it just freaked us out. I mean, we're part of that initial group who just went on and then started the word of mouth and probably pissed a lot of people off by forcing them to watch this home movie, but it really holds up. It's I don't know how they pulled that movie off.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I remember that the sort of marketing was trying to get people to believe that it was real. So when I saw it, I wasn't sure, you know.
And one of the last times I think where you could conceivably do that too, right? I remember when The Ring came out, there was a lot of talk too about, you know, whether or not something is going to come out and get you, or whether the supernatural force in that movie is going to come across the proscenium and like genuinely fuck your life up. But Blair Witch like came out before there was too much internet, so there was no way to kind of fact check that movie did or did not happen. I thought it was real. It might be that maybe the real marketing thing, you know, is that, oh, it was fake, but they really killed those kids. I don't know. I mean,
think Josh Leonard still has a lot of, is that his name, right? Like there's the one actor.
He's the one who just disappeared. You don't know.
Oh, okay.
Oh, so he made it out. But the others are dead. Where have they been?
we don't know. I mean, anytime that technology changes, people get scared as hell and they make horror movies about it, right? I mean, Unfriended is about that to a degree. I think Blair Witch is about that.
Poltergeist about the television.
Yeah, about the TV. The Damned about science and genetic engineering and all those. I think it's The Damned, the Joseph Losey picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
With say what?
Or These Are the Damned.
These Are the Damned. I know it is The Damned.
It can be either.
But,
Videodrome, I just want to put out there too.
Yeah, oh yeah, and Videodrome too, for sure. Yeah, I mean, all movies that are like, you know, oh my God, this technology is going to have some ability to completely upset your life because we don't know how it works, right? So if we don't know how it works, it already has that component of the unknown, and we're ready to meet it halfway there and be terrified by it.
Luckily, we all know how it works now, and we're in charge of it. It does not subvert our lives in any possible way.
I have no idea how any of this shit works. I clicked on a link and then I ended up here, and that's the one.
When are we going to get a great Twitter horror film? Or is Twitter itself the horror?
It is itself the most terrifying thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's already a horror show.
Since we were talking about television with Twin Peaks, the television show Twin Peaks, I feel like the most disreputable horror films, which were a huge phenomena for a long time, were made-for-TV movies.
They're so good, though. Like
so
some
good.
of the '70s ones.
And they have to fit inside the parameters of what's acceptable. So it winds up being almost all ages horror, which is somehow even more terrifying because as a child you could stumble across it. Because I remember seeing as a kid Devil Dog Hound of Hell, Curtis Harrington film, which is like still haunts me, even though it's obviously super low rent, super cheap, but also like somehow scarier for being so cheap and on the fly. It's just something about it feels just I don't know, just sort of icky and dangerous. But Harrington had a bunch of those films. He made like 10 of those.
There's a special category of 1970s television horror because they just invaded your living room. It's Salem's Lot, it's Trilogy of Terror, it's Devil Dog Hound of Hell.
Bad Ronald, which, you know, could give you the suggestion that there's a boy living in your wall.
Right.
But and then it makes its way into like slightly not quite horror, but also like Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, which had a big effect on me because it was Kiss. And then Mazes and Monsters, the Tom Hanks thing, which was like the first ever Tom Hanks movie, which was like kind of a big deal. I think it was NBC made a big deal at Mazes and Monsters. Anyway, but yeah, big. I mean, I feel like you've programmed a lot of these, Cristina.
Maybe. I mean, they're harder to find. Like they might exist in like 16 millimeter form, and they were hard to clear rights.
Sure.
So it's the kind of thing that I couldn't always get to for that reason. But before Alamo at 92Y Tribeca, because we had a 16 millimeter projector, I did a few more there. Like we did Bad Ronald there, and like when you can come across those on 60 millimeter, it is a joy. But yeah, they are hard to show theatrically for rights reasons, but they're very, very fun. Like always surprisingly, like so much better than you would expect, you know?
Cristina, I have one more question because I know we're running out of time, but if you had to program a horror movie, I don't know whether it's a marathon or just a movie for 2020, let's just say everything about 2020 is the same except that we can all go to the movies. It feels like there's no way of actually getting at the true real life terrors. So I'm asking this because I also wonder what I should actually be watching this year. Nothing feels quite right.
I don't know. Is it time to revisit Aronofsky's Mother yet?
Loved that movie.
Oh, I love.
I feel like when I saw that movie, because that was like 2017. I was like, this movie is exactly like this year, but it might be even more like this year than than anything else.
That's a great call.
I was very into that movie. I couldn't believe how much I liked it.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Very much same.
I'm returning. Thank you. Eric, one last thing I wanted to say to tie it back into reverse shot and this idea of when Jeff said I used to force him to watch horror movies. There is an old reverse shot symposium that was all about people fessing up to movies that they had never seen before and then being forced to watch them and write an essay about them. And yours was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So in a sense, you were forced to watch it and you were very reluctant. So what was your experience like of watching that for the first time?
It was in a sense everything I expected it to be in terms of being, unendurable for the graphic nature of it, but also I thought it was an absolute masterpiece, and I'm so grateful that I watched it because I have seen it once since then. But I mean, I'm just somebody, just my own little personal stuff is images have a great effect on me. I don't have an ability once I take in an image to sort of put it in some context and project it back out. It winds up having an effect on me. It lives in me. And it's like as if anything existed in front of me in the real world. What comes in through cinema still affects me that way. So I actually am a bit of a baby about some of this stuff. But Texas Chainsaw, as it happens, is actually less. What was so brilliant for me, what I thought was so brilliant about it is not just imagery that does that, but the sound design I thought was in another world. Like the sounds that and realizing how sound design actually covers for what you don't see. There's actually very few moments of actual gore that you see in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It's all about what sound design does and creates into your own, creates images in your own head, which is much, much worse. So no, I love that experience. And I'm so grateful that I had an opportunity for you to make me watch it. And
it's going to be showing at the drive-in.
It is Friday, October 30th in a double bill with Halloween.
Oh, wow.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty exciting.
Oh.
Yeah, we're doing a whole week of Halloween themed programming at the Queen's Drive-In at the end of the month. So come on by if you've got a car. But I want to, because this is the theme of this was Disreputable Halloween, I just want to put a shout out to the curators of Disreputable Cinema at Museum of the Moving Image, who we've not seen since we closed in March, but Jesse Berberick and Justin Rodriguez, two wonderful colleagues of ours who took the initiative and created that series knowing that we didn't have any programming like that. And in fact, I think their argument was, well, Cristina does this at the Alamo. How come we don't do anything like this in Queens? So we started doing that and had a solid year of really, really great programming there, and we missed them and hope we get back into the building and do Disreputable Cinema again.
Watch these movies together. I would love that. So who are we toasting to today?
Well, just want to shouting out in the audience, joining us, the Reverse Shotters, Chloe Lizotte, Chris Wisniewski, Edo Choi, Nathan Kasub, and Ryan Swen.
Hey guys.
Hi guys.
Hello all.
Thanks for coming.
Hey, what are we toasting to?
What are you toasting to?
Reputable horror movies, unless someone has our mother.
Being scared.
How about eventually being able to watch movies together?
Yeah, that one works.
Yes.
So watching movies together.
Especially horror movies. I mean, my God, there's a whole other layer that comes for watching horror movies together.
Yeah, we're all already scared together now, but watching a horror movie.
That's going to be really interesting to see the first pandemic, panic, fucking COVID, or God damn it, I'm just exhausted thinking about it. Like,
no, they're
what
like
is the first one going to be like?
I don't want to know.
I mean, there'll be like 10 terrible ones that we're just going to have to put up with, and then there'll be like one good one. Or there'll be 10 kind of whatever ones that, a decade from now we'll watch it and be like, oh, like Cristina says, this one has a shelf life. It's aged beautifully like a fine wine, right? I wanted to give a quick shout out when Cristina and I were G-chatting about what constitutes a disreputable horror film, of like two titles that we were pondering whether or not they're disreputable because they have a reputation in France, but those people are very easily shocked. So it's like, take it with a grain of salt. Don't Deliver Us from Evil and A Very Curious Girl. Don't Deliver Us from Evil, especially because it's about like freaky adolescent girls. And there's teens are scary, as we've established. Teen girls are really fucking scary. And when teen girls get together and decide to start killing people, it's like a whole other kettle of fish. Like, the Slender Man phenomenon that took off, which I think they already made a movie about, with those girls who would like make a pact to like kill people because some made up internet shit told them about it. I feel like that movie, or that urban legend, deserved like a much better film. I didn't see the one that came out about it, so I don't know if it's
2018 Slender Man. I missed that too.
Yeah, I mean, maybe in 10 years we'll all be talking about it on like Zoom 2.0, but the idea that you can have a movie about teenage girls who have this collective hysteria and decide to take the anger and the fear and the rage, and instead of putting it inward, like put it outward and start really terrorizing people for whatever reason they decide to do it. I mean, that's an enduring theme in horror movies in general. But then with the Slender Man thing, you get that scary internet component too, you know.
Well, the Slender Man will have to wait for the next discussion.